Charles Taze Russell, he's the founder of Jehovah's Witnesses, and he co-wrote a book titled Three Worlds. He wrote this in the 1800s, and he co-wrote this book titled Three Worlds, and in it he said that Christ would return in 1874. When nothing happened in 1874, that date was revised to 1914. When nothing happened in 1914, Russell's successor, this is Joseph Franklin Rutherford, said Jesus had returned in 1914. He'd just done so invisibly. Convenient. Now, because of these failed prophecies, along with some very secretive and authoritarian leadership, 3/4 of the church of the Jehovah's Witnesses had basically left the church by the 1920s. But that didn't stop the Jehovah's Witnesses. They have since declared 2 other dates for Jesus' return, one being in 1925 and one being in 1975, both of which passed by uneventfully. Yet predicting Jesus' return is not a new thing. It's been happening ever since the first century. And in our passage today, the Apostle Paul addresses a rumor that Jesus, this rumor spread among the church in Thessalonica, that Jesus had already returned. And this rumor was causing a fair amount of distress for the church. I mean, think about it. The Thessalonians, they'd already been taught by Paul that Jesus would one day return, okay? And as Jesus himself teaches, when he returns, this is in the parable of the weeds in Matthew chapter 13, he says, when I return, I'm going to gather all my followers together and I will take them to be with me in heaven, while the weeds, that's the non-believers, they will be burned up in hell. Now, here's the thing. If Jesus has already returned and you're still stuck here on earth, then doesn't that suggest that maybe you're not one of Jesus' real followers and you're therefore destined for hell? Well, that's the situation that Paul is addressing in our passage today. So like I said, we are looking at a very short sermon series. We're just doing 2 Thessalonians over the holidays, like we did chapter 1 back in January, looking at Paul's prayers. And in 2 Thessalonians 1, we saw that Paul dealt with a situation in Thessalonica where the Christians were being persecuted for their faith. In chapter 2, Paul turns to another situation in Thessalonica, which has to do with certain false teachers that had infiltrated their ranks, and they started teaching that Jesus had already returned. But what made this lie even worse is that they were attributing it to the Apostle Paul. They said, Paul tells us that Jesus has already returned. And so the poor Thessalonians, they are freaking out. And so to allay their fears, Paul says, look, guys, don't you remember that when I was with you, I told you about all of this? It's actually why we don't get much detail in this passage, because in verse 5, he says, look, I've already given you all the detail when I was with you. And I told you then that Jesus' return cannot happen until 2 very big and very public events happen. The first is the rebellion, and the second is the coming of the man of lawlessness. Now, who is the man of lawlessness? Well, the Apostle John calls him the Antichrist. You've probably most likely heard of him as the Antichrist. And so that's what we're looking at today. We're looking at the end times, and in particular, this biblical figure known as the Antichrist. And I've got 3 points to help us unpack this passage in regards to this end time figure. There are 3, you can see those 3 points on the inside of your news sheet. So we're going to begin by looking at what Paul has to tell us about this man of lawlessness. But here's the thing, just as important as what Paul tells us is what he doesn't tell us about the man of lawlessness. So that's what we're going to be looking at point 1. I've just titled it, The Man of Lawlessness. We're then going to see that while there is a historical figure to come called the man of lawlessness or the Antichrist, Paul says the things he will do are already happening right now in our world. And so I've titled this point, The Secret Power of Lawlessness. That's in verse 7. And then we'll conclude with our application, which is what Paul tells we Christians to do in regards to this secret power of lawlessness. And I've titled that point, Overcoming Lawlessness. That's verses 11 and 12. So let's dive on in and look at the man of lawlessness. And our passage begins, like I said, Paul is changing gears from persecution in chapter 1 to a particular teaching they had received. And this teaching, you can see it in chapter 2, verse 1, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him. And he says, we ask you, brothers and sisters, not to become easily unsettled. Now, why have they been unsettled? Because certain false teachers were asserting, verse 2, that the day of the Lord has already come. Now, why does Paul say, don't be unsettled by this teaching? It's because anyone who thinks they can calculate the end of the world is a class A crackpot. There's this particular episode of Parks and Rec, one of my favourite TV shows, where there's a local cult that every 5 or 10 years they would predict the end of the world, and they would go and hire out the park and they would wait for the end of the world to come. And Ron Swanson would always go along because he makes handmade flutes, and he would sell them his handmade flutes because wooden flutes were a very important part of their cult, and he would sell them at inflated prices. And the guys would say, oh, would you take a check? You can cash it tomorrow. And Ron would say, yeah, I'll take your checks. And he went and cashed them the next day when the end of the world didn't come, right? And here's the thing, the Bible purposefully gives very little information about when Jesus is going to return. In fact, 1 Thessalonians 5 tells us that Jesus is going to return like a thief in the night. No one's going to know. And the reason the Bible is so ambiguous on when the end of the world will come is to ensure that Christians don't sit around being distracted by eschatological speculation, end-time speculation. So anyone who claims they know when Jesus is returning is a class A crackpot. Do not listen to them. Do not be unsettled by them. Because the Bible says when it happens, we are all going to know about it anyway. But the Bible does give us a bit of information on this. And what it says is that right before Jesus returns, now theologians call that day the Parousia or Judgment Day, okay? Right before Judgment Day, the Bible says that a particular man is going to rise to prominence who will lead the rebellion. Now, the rebellion, we learn about this in Revelation chapter 20. All the nations are going to gather together to fight God and fight his people. And the person leading this rebellion is described in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And we're told 7 things about this man of lawlessness. And like I said, he doesn't tell us everything because he'd already told the Thessalonians most of this. He's just reminding them. But we've got 7 things we learn. So firstly, he's going to be a human. Now, there is some speculation as to whether the Antichrist will be an individual or a group or a movement. There's a bit of debate over that. But even if it is a group or a movement, it is a human group or movement. Right? The Antichrist is not going to be an angel or a demon. It's going to be human. Second, this man will consider himself to be above the law. We'll look a little bit more at that. He's doomed to destruction. That's the third thing we learn. We learn that in verse 3. The fourth thing we learn in verse 4 is that he's going to set himself up as a false god. Number 5, though he is a man, he comes in the power of Satan. We learn that in verse 9. The power he gets from Satan, number 6, is going to allow him to perform all sorts of miracles and signs and wonders. And those signs and wonders, this is the 7th thing we learn, he's going to give him unparalleled ability to deceive people. They're going to see this magic and go, this guy must be impressive. We need to follow him. And so our first bit of application for today is we need to be vigilant about this. Right? God doesn't reveal things in the Bible unless they're important to his people. And what he's revealed here is that the man of lawlessness will deceive people. So we need to be vigilant so that we're not one of those poor sods that he ends up deceiving. But at the same time, while we're being vigilant, we also need to be humble, right? Be vigilant, but be humble. And why is that? It's because apart from those 7 things, we're not really told much more about this figure. We have no idea who he's going to be. We're not told if he's going to be a political leader or a religious leader. He might just be a philosophy professor. We don't know. All right? We're told he's going to set himself up in the temple of God, but no commentator has any idea what that means. I mean, which temple? The temple was destroyed in AD 70. What does that mean? And no commentator knows who is currently holding him back. Verse 6, we're not told that either. And so while we need to be vigilant, keeping an eye out for this deceiver, we need to be very careful about speculating over who this might be. Right? Many have claimed throughout church history to know who the Antichrist is. Very early on in church history, everyone thought the emperor, Caesar, was the Antichrist because he called for emperor worship. And then in the Reformation, many of the reformers said, the Pope is the Antichrist. Well, then you got Hitler, he's the Antichrist, or Stalin, he's the Antichrist. But all of these speculations have been wrong so far. The reason we know that is because the end is not yet here. Right? Those people died out. So they couldn't have been the Antichrist. And so when we discuss things like the end times, like Revelation, like the Antichrist, or this passage here, before we do so, we need to drink a big, long glass of humility. Because the Bible is purposefully ambiguous on topics like this to stop us from being needlessly distracted. Right? The fact is, if God wanted us to know who the man of lawlessness is going to be, or if he wanted us to know when he was going to return, he would have told us. But he hasn't. So we need to be very careful and very humble when looking into these matters. So that's the parousia. It's a big word. It's a Greek word, the second coming. And that's going to come in verse 6 at the proper time, where it's going to be revealed at the proper time. Then in verse 7, Paul says something quite alarming. He says this, "For the secret power of lawlessness is already at work." Understand what he's saying. He's saying there is going to be a particular historical figure that is going to arise. He's going to be called the man of lawlessness. He will arise at the proper time. But the deception that he is going to bring with him is already present in our world. This secret power of lawlessness is already at work. What that means is people are already being deceived. Now, the Apostle John says a very similar thing. I just want to read you one verse. This is from 1 John 2:18. If you want to write that down, you can look it up later. 1 John 2:18 says this, "Dear children, this is the last hour, and as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come." So John's saying the same thing as Paul is saying here. There are many little a Antichrists who have already appeared. Now again, we're not told enough to be able to identify who these little a Antichrists are, so be humble, but we can identify their deception. And their deception is lawlessness. They operate through this secret power of lawlessness. Verse 7. Here's the question, what does that mean? Well, the Greek word that we translate as lawless here is the word anomia. Now, nomos means law in Greek, and when you put an A or an alpha in front of a Greek word, it actually reverses the meaning of the word. You get the exact opposite. So if a theist is someone who believes in God, an atheist is someone who believes there's no God. Okay? So nomia means you are an adherent to the law. Anomia means you think there is no law. Let me explain what this means. C.S. Lewis wrote a book titled The Abolition of Man. I am not recommending you go out and read it. It's a very hard book. But in this book, he said, up until around the 1900s, most societies throughout history based their moral law codes on what they saw was the natural law of the universe. So this is why most societies throughout history have known that murder is wrong and theft is wrong and lying is wrong and greed is wrong. Right? Most societies know that. But around the 1940s, a principle started to creep into Western thinking that says, who is right to say what is right or wrong? How do we know what is right or wrong? So this principle basically says there is no universal or natural law, and that we have to figure out for ourselves what is right or wrong for us. Now, if you take this to its natural conclusion, anything goes. I saw an example of this last week. So there's Charlie Kirk clips all over the internet still through his assassination 2 weeks ago. And I watched one during the week where he was debating with an atheist on a college campus somewhere. And Charlie asked him, point blank, do you think the Holocaust was objectively wrong? And the atheist said, no, I cannot declare that the Holocaust is objectively wrong. And that's where you have to end up if you're an atheist of integrity, right? If there is no God, then there is no universal lawgiver. And then therefore, there is no universal law. And for the past 60 to 80 years, this secret power of lawlessness has been growing in the West, all right? So Paul said a secret power has been released into the world, and that would grow into many different manifestations. Many small a antichrists would be out there deceiving people through this power. And one of those manifestations is this notion that moral judgments are now subjective. Right? There's no natural law, there's no universal law that our actions must align with. And so if I feel like doing this thing over here, or I feel like not doing that thing over there, then I'm just going to do it. Now, in case you don't realize the danger of this, let me remind you of what the 20th century brought us. It brought us fascism and communism. Now, fascism, this is what Hitler was a proponent of, and communism, which is what Stalin and Mao were proponents of, they are diametrically opposed ideologies. Right? Their views on things such as race and economics and government are both diametrically opposed. Yet the 20th century saw genocides by both ideologies, the like of which the human race has never seen before. And the reason those wicked regimes were able to carry out their wicked actions is because of the secret power of lawlessness. Right? They weren't disobeying God's natural laws. They were denying they exist altogether. And when you deny the natural or eternal law, if you are going to be a person of integrity, you have to assert that such wicked actions like the Holocaust, well, they're not objectively wrong. And that's what Paul is warning us against. Right? When the man of lawlessness appears, he will operate in the secret power of lawlessness, but that secret power is already at work in our world today. Verse 7. So, next question is, what do we do? If this secret power of lawlessness is already at work, how do we deal with this? Well, there are two things I want to bring to our attention by way of application from this passage today. All right? And the first is, in those famous words of Lance Corporal Jack Jones, don't panic. Anyone a fan of Dad's Army here? All right? Don't panic. Paul says, I'm not sharing these frightening details with the Thessalonians to unsettle you. He literally says, we ask you, brothers and sisters, not to become easily unsettled. And the reason we should not be unsettled is because God is in charge of history. Right? He's told us ahead of time what's going to happen. Not just so that we'll be vigilant, but so that we will be unsettled. We won't be unsettled by it. Now, yes, terrifying things will happen when the man of lawlessness appears. But terrifying things have been happening since Jesus left. Right? The secret power of lawlessness is already in our world. And the first half of the 20th century has arguably seen the greatest iteration of that so far. But the end has not yet come. So don't panic. And there are two things that should help us not panic about this lawlessness. So the first is, God is in control of this secret power of lawlessness. See, while we're not told exactly who is currently holding this man of lawlessness back, it might be an angel, we don't know, we're not told, but what we can be sure of is it is God who is in control of this situation, and it is God who will take this person out of the way at the proper time. Right? Everything in history is happening according to God's plans because he is in charge of history. The second thing, the reason we should not panic, is that even when the secret power of lawlessness is given free rein, right, this is when the man of lawlessness is revealed, Jesus will overthrow him with the breath of his mouth, verse 8. Right, Jesus is just going to go, and he's gone. So don't panic, because God is in control and he is in charge of history. Second thing we need to do by way of application is make sure we're on the right side of that history. Now, we can't stop the secret power of lawlessness. It's already at work. Verse 7, what we can do is we can make sure we're not on the side of lawlessness. And Paul closes this passage by showing there's only two sides, right, to this battle. There's the deluded side or there's the side of truth. So let me read it again. Verse 10, I'm going to go from halfway through verse 10. They perish because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. For this reason, God sends them a powerful delusion so they will believe the lie, and so that all will be condemned who have not believed the truth but have delighted in wickedness. There's only two sides to this battle. All right? There's no sitting on the fence. As the saying goes, Satan owns the fence. We can either be on the side of truth or the side of lies. But notice why people choose the side of lies. It's the last three words. They delight in wickedness. They reject the truth because they find wickedness more enjoyable. And so the million-dollar question is, how do you and I avoid delighting in wickedness? Well, like our first application point, there are two things we need to do to make sure we're on the right side of history, all right? And the first is to believe that there is a universal law out there that was instilled by God at creation. And the Bible actually tells us this in the opening chapter of the Bible. Right? So in Genesis chapter 1, we learn that on day 1, God created light. But then on day 4, he created the heavenly lights, the sun, the moon, and the stars. Then on day 2, God separated the waters above from the waters below. The waters above he called sky, the waters below he called ocean. And then on day 5, he created animals for the sky and animals for the ocean. Then on day 3, God created land. And on day 6, he created land animals, including we humans. Now, what this teaches us, the thing that Genesis 1 teaches us is, number one, the world was created by God, but number two, it was created in a very ordered and structured way. And if we go against the structure that God has built into his universe, bad things happen. Now, that structure has to do with the laws of physics. If you jump off a 12-story building without a parachute, bad things will happen. Right? But there's also a moral law that he's set up. And when we go against that moral law code, we descend into wickedness. So that's step one. Right? We need to realize there is a moral law code out there, a universal law. Step two is we need to find God's law more delightful than sin. Right? The fact is, sin is fun. If it wasn't fun, no one would do it. So how do we avoid delighting in wickedness? Well, it is not by trying really hard to delight in God's laws. Right? That would be sanctification by works. And it doesn't work. Sin will always draw us back. There will always be something that will show us, make us think there's going to be more fun over here. The way we find God's laws more delightful than sin is by finding the lawgiver more delightful than sin. Paul actually hints at this in verse 8. He says, the man of lawlessness will not only be overthrown by Jesus going, right? He'll be overthrown by the splendor of his coming. That's what we need to be looking at. We need to be looking at the splendor of the King. And the splendor of the King is seen nowhere more clearly than in the cross. In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus tells a parable about a man who owns 10,000 bags of gold. That's the new NIV translation. It's literally 10,000 talents. Now, 1 talent is about 20 years' wages. Now, for rounding purposes, let's say the average wage is $100,000. When we multiply $100,000 by 20 years, then by 10,000, right, it's 10,000 talents, we get $20 trillion. The GDP of Australia is 1.7 trillion. And Jesus is saying this person owes $20 trillion. Now, why is it that it is such a massive amount? It is to show us that the debt Jesus took upon himself is unfathomable. Right? It's basically, Jesus took upon himself a $20 trillion debt for every single one of his people. Friends, what breaks the delight of wickedness is the delight of grace. For when we marvel at the splendor of God's grace, the splendor of sin starts to fade. And that, brothers and sisters, is how we overcome the secret power of lawlessness. So, do not be unsettled by those who claim Jesus has already returned, whether visibly or invisibly. The Bible tells us the rebellion and the man of lawlessness must come first. So be vigilant, even now, because the secret power of lawlessness is already at work. But we overcome that secret power by resting in the fact that God is in control of history. And that when the lawless one will be revealed, the Lord Jesus will overthrow him with the breath of his mouth and destroy him by the splendor of his coming.